The wind howls, screaming through the thin air at 26,000 feet. Snow whips across the frozen slopes, turning Everest into a nightmare. A man lies still, half buried in ice, his body frozen solid. His skin is blackened with frostbite. His breath is shallow. That man is Beck Weathers, and he's about to do the impossible. Beck Weathers wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't a professional climber, nor a fearless explorer. He was a pathologist from Texas, a husband and a father. A man with a job, a mortgage, and a deep internal struggle that no one could see. For years, he battled crippling depression. It wasn't the kind that made you cry. It was the kind that made you feel nothing at all. No joy, no sadness. Just a numbness that swallowed everything. Then, he found mountaineering. Up in the mountains, Beck felt alive. The pain in his muscles, the struggle for every breath. It reminded him he was still here. He became obsessed, chasing bigger and bigger peaks. His ultimate goal? The 7 summits, the highest mountains on each continent. And now, standing at the base of Everest, he was closer than ever to making that dream a reality. Beck wasn't climbing alone. He had joined Adventure Consultants, a guided expedition led by Rob Hall, one of the most respected mountaineers in the world. His team was filled with people just like him, ordinary individuals chasing extraordinary dreams. There was Yasuko Namba, a quiet yet determined woman from Japan, aiming to become the oldest woman to complete the 7 summits. There was Doug Hansen, a postal worker who had sacrificed everything to be here. And then there were the guides, the men responsible for getting everyone up and back down alive. Everest was dangerous, everyone knew that. But this was different. 1996 had been a warm season, melting the ice and making the mountain more unstable than usual. There were too many climbers, too many risks, but no one wanted to turn back. Beck didn't know it yet, but this climb would test him in ways he'd never imagined. Climbing Everest isn't just a hike, it's a war against your own body. Every step at this altitude feels like lifting a cinder block. Oxygen levels are dangerously low. Your brain slows down, your muscles weaken, and every breath burns your lungs like fire. Beck had already spent weeks on the mountain, moving between base camps, forcing his body to adapt to the death zone. Now, it was May 10th, 1996, Summit Day. The team left Camp 4 in the dark, moving toward the peak. The wind was brutal, the air biting at their exposed skin. The higher they climbed, the more exhausted they became. But they had one goal, the summit. Beck, however, was struggling with something no one else was, his vision. Years before, he'd undergone radial keratotomy, an eye surgery that worked fine at sea level. But up here, in Everest's thin air, his corneas weren't getting enough oxygen. His eyesight was fading fast. By the time he reached 27,000 feet, he could barely see at all. Rob Hall, knowing it was too dangerous for Beck to continue, made a decision. "Stay here, wait for me. I'll help you down when I return from the summit." Beck had no choice. He sat in the snow and waited. Hours passed. The wind grew stronger, the air colder. His hands trembled inside his gloves, but he told himself he'd be okay. He had no idea that time was running out. As the hours dragged on, the mountain came alive with chaos. Climbers were stuck in bottlenecks, waiting for others to pass. Time was slipping away. The delays meant that Rob Hall and his clients were still high on the mountain when they should have been descending. Beck, still waiting where Hall had left him, was in trouble. His vision wasn't improving. He was alone, exposed to the brutal wind. Every passing minute sapped his strength. Then came the worst possible news. A storm was moving in. The temperature plummeted. The wind picked up, howling like a freight train. Snow erased the trail, turning the mountain into an endless white void. Hall didn't come back. No one did. Beck realized the truth. He had been forgotten. By now, Beck was barely conscious. His hands, face, and feet had gone completely numb. He didn't shiver anymore, a terrifying sign that his body was shutting down. At some point, two climbers found him. They grabbed his arms, tried to pull him to his feet, but Beck couldn't move. His body was too far gone. One of them shook their head. They had to make an impossible choice: leave him behind or die trying to save him. They let go. Beck slumped into the snow, alone. The storm raged on. His body stopped shaking, his breathing slowed, his eyes closed. Everything faded to black. For most people, this is where the story ends. No one survives being left on Everest overnight. Not in a storm, not in the death zone. But Beck Weathers wasn't like most people. The storm swallowed Everest. Climbers were lost in the whiteout, their cries drowned by the screaming wind. Some, like Yasuko Namba and Doug Hansen, would never make it back. Beck wasn't supposed to, either. In the morning, rescuers found him. His body was curled into the snow, frozen solid. His face was black with frostbite. His gloves were gone, his hands nothing more than lumps of ice. They checked for a pulse, nothing. They marked him as dead and moved on, but then something happened that no one could explain. Hours later, Beck's eyes snapped open. His body was beyond frozen. His right arm was dead. His nose was hardened like stone. But somewhere deep inside, his mind refused to die. Through the haze of pain, a single thought surfaced: get up. No one was coming for him. If he wanted to live, he had to save himself. He forced himself onto his knees. His body screamed in agony. His feet were barely there, frozen, unrecognizable. But step by step, he started walking. He stumbled, fell, got back up, fell again. But somehow, someway, he kept going. At one point, his legs gave out completely. He collapsed into the snow. This was it. This was where he was supposed to die. But then, something deep inside him ignited. A primal instinct, stronger than pain. He pushed himself up, step by step, breath by breath. Every step felt like his last. But he refused to stop. Then, against all odds, he made it. When the other climbers saw Beck stumble into Camp 4, they couldn't believe it. He should have been dead, but he wasn't. Somehow, he was still standing. Beck Weathers shouldn't have been alive. After spending nearly 15 hours frozen in Everest's death zone, he had walked himself back to the living. His body was broken, his hands black with frostbite, his face barely recognizable. But somehow, his heart was still beating. The climbers at Camp 4 were stunned. They had already written him off as dead. Now, they had to figure out how to save him. At this altitude, a rescue was nearly impossible. No one had ever been airlifted from this height. Helicopters simply couldn't function in Everest's thin air. But they had no choice. If Beck didn't get down soon, he wouldn't last another night. When the distress call was sent, only one pilot dared to try. Lieutenant Column Madan Khatri Chatri. He had no guarantee he could even land, but he was willing to risk it. The helicopter strained against the altitude, its rotors barely holding on. The pilot fought the wind, the pressure, the weight. He had seconds to land. Then, somehow, he did. The climbers rushed forward, dragging Beck toward the open door. The chopper lurched, almost too heavy to lift off. But the pilot pulled up, and the machine rose. Beck was going home. Beck was immediately flown to Kathmandu, then Texas. Doctors fought to save what they could. His right arm, gone. His left hand, fingers amputated. His nose, rebuilt from his ear and forehead. When he finally looked in the mirror, he didn't recognize the man staring back. His injuries were devastating, but Everest had given him something back. Before the climb, Beck had been lost, not on a mountain, but in his own life. He had chased Everest like a man running from something. And now, he finally understood what he had been missing. Lying in a hospital bed, his wife Peach sat beside him. Before he left for Everest, their marriage had been crumbling. She had grown tired of his obsession with mountains, of feeling like she and their children weren't enough. She had nearly left him. Now she stayed. As she sat by his hospital bed, Beck realized something. He had been chasing death, and he had finally found life. Beck never climbed again. Instead, he built his life back from the ground up as a husband, a father, a survivor. He had lost so much, but in the end, he had won something greater: his life.